if we're limited in terms of the capacity to use those butt muscles because of tightness around the front of the hip, that's not only going to cause problems locally to the hip, that can also have those knock-on effects.
That Triathlon Show, episode 45. Hello, what's up everybody? Welcome to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. As always, I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode, we're talking about injuries and especially overuse injuries from running. If you're anything like the majority of triathletes, then you have probably had some sort of running injury or even just some overuse niggle. And in today's episode, you'll learn more about that. Some things that we talk about is how overuse injuries are often the result of dysfunctional movement patterns. And we go into what the most common examples of such dysfunctional movement patterns are, in particular as it pertains to running. And you'll also get a framework for a short 15-minute maintenance routine that you can use as a prehab routine to prevent those injuries from coming up, and it will contain all the essential elements for avoiding these kinds of dysfunctional movement patterns, including mobility, activation, stabilization, and strengthening exercises that will keep you running and training injury-free, provided, of course, that you follow a sensible training schedule and don't do too much too soon, and so on and so forth. And my guest today is, I'm very happy to announce, James Dunne of Kinetic Revolution. He's a sports rehab therapist and a running coach and works with mostly runners at this point, but also a lot of triathletes and sprinters, footballers, rugby players and hockey players. And he is himself actually previously has been a professional rugby player, but has transitioned more and more into the endurance world and running especially. He's a great expert on the subject, and as I mentioned in the interview, whenever somebody asks me about some sort of niggle or injury, or if I myself have a niggle or injury, the first place that I turn to is Kinetic Revolution, James' website, or his YouTube channel. And when I was out with my patellofemoral pain syndrome for 9 months from running just before I started doing triathlons, James' resources were a big part of my rehab program that got me back running again, and I have been running injury free since then. And part of James' resources, or his learnings essentially, or his teachings I should say, are still to this day part of my prehab routines. So I'm very happy to welcome my friend James Dunne to the show, and we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's just jump right into the interview. All right, so on today's interview on That Triathlon Show, I'm happy to welcome my friend James Dunne from Kinetic Revolution. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we've been actually talking about this for quite some time, but it had just never happened until now. Just recently, I happened to see that you are actually reviving your own podcast, and had to reply to that email to get you on mine. So it was a good coincidence that you're reviving that, because that brought the thing back to my memory.
Yeah, I laughed when I saw your email come back in response to the email that I sent out about the podcast, and I thought it's great because we haven't hooked up in a while. Actually, it's time that we spoke. But no, the podcast at our end, it's been kind of lying dormant for, I don't know, too long, 2 years at least. We've got a fair few episodes in the backlog there, but I just kind of put it to one side. So now this is a new focus, getting out there and making the most of Facebook Live to actually try and then make a podcast.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to experiencing that Facebook Live kind of podcast. And of course, that will be linked up in the show notes for the listeners as well. So let's talk a bit about your background first. You're a sports rehab therapist and a running coach. And you write on your website that you have a passion for identifying and correcting dysfunctional movement patterns that cause overuse injuries or impair efficiency in endurance athletes. So what does this really mean in practice? What do you do in your job?
Okay, so that all sounds very kind of flowery and kind of highfalutin, but in reality, what it is helping athletes overcome their injuries, and particularly when we're talking about endurance athletes, it's overcoming overuse injuries. And when it comes to overuse injuries, the big kind of way of explaining, if you like, what an overuse injury really boils down to, it's that there's some sort of biomechanical overload that has come about as a result of a movement pattern that places undue amount of stress or strain upon a certain tissue, a movement pattern that is in some way starting to therefore create the situation where pain occurs, where injury occurs, and then that is exacerbated by training volume. So obviously we all want to train for whatever event we've signed up for, whether that's a marathon, whether that's an Ironman, whether that's your first sprint try. And if there is some sort of movement pattern somewhere along the lines, which is as you start to increase the amount of running you're getting done, starting to, let's say, pick on your patellofemoral joint, beginning to pick on your knee, then all of a sudden that can start to become a problem, start resulting in pain. And it's my job to help identify what those underlying movement patterns are, what it is that's starting to actually result in the increased amount of stress and strain on that particular tissue, and from there help you with, on one hand, strengthening and mobilizing and stabilizing all the important areas around that joint or around that tissue, and on the other hand, help you from a technique perspective to try and actually improve how you're moving, how you're running, so that you can get back into your training and overcome the injury in the first place and stop the injury becoming a recurring problem. And I think we both know athletes who unfortunately seem to be stuck on this, if you excuse the pun, treadmill of overuse injuries that seem to come back and haunt them. So classic examples, plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, those kinds of things, where they do their rehab, so that they've rested for a while, they've strengthened, they've perhaps been having some regular soft tissue work, and they've reintroduced running into their training. But because they haven't necessarily got to the bottom of the actual movement pattern, the technique aspect, the biomechanical aspect that has dictated why the given tissue, let's say the Achilles, was overloaded, as they start getting back into their running volume, all of a sudden they get to a kind of a critical point where, guess what, that same overload either begins to raise its head and cause problems again, or through compensation, which is often a problem, and the way we move differently to accommodate pain, and those compensations sometimes tend to hang around, we end up with a secondary injury elsewhere. So basically it's helping athletes move better and overcome their injuries.
Okay, so let's sum that whole thing up for the listeners. So essentially you have a dysfunctional movement pattern, and that leads to undue stress on a tissue or a joint, and that can then lead to, when you combine that with the volume of training, to getting an overuse injury. And you also have the mobility, stabilization, and strength factor that come into play, but that dysfunctional movement can and should be corrected also with correct form and technique. Is that about right?
Absolutely, and the big thing that always leads to a lot of frustration, and sometimes I meet runners who have been passed from one specialist to another, so from one physio to another, or osteopath or whoever, who have been dealing with an injury, a chronic injury, for quite some time, and running is the main exacerbating factor for the injury, or the reason why the injury came on in the first place. Yet nobody has ever actually looked at them run. Nobody has ever actually said, let's leave this treatment room and let's go out into the car park, let's go out into the gym and get you on the treadmill, although I would prefer that people look to people outside, because that's kind of more real. Running on a treadmill is different, and see what it is you're doing when you're running that's starting to lead to perhaps your knee pain or your calf pain or your back pain, or why is your injury to do with your running? Why is it linked to your running? Without looking at somebody run, it's impossible to really be able to get to the bottom of that. And unfortunately, so many runners go through the whole treatment process without anybody actually looking at them run.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate. And I have suffered from patellar tendonitis myself for a long time. Was out 9 months from running, and that was when I turned to triathlon. And fortunately, I had a physiotherapist that did look at me run on the treadmill and helped me a lot. So yeah, there's definitely massive value in that. But I also had a lot of help from going through your stuff on your website, and that is why I now recommend your resources to my athletes when they have something come up in terms of niggles. You mentioned a few different kinds of overuse injuries: Achilles tendonitis, hamstring tendinopathy, and patellofemoral pain syndrome, and so on. What are the most common ones that you see in runners and endurance athletes?
Yeah, so I think kind of starting ground upwards, if you like, we could talk about things like plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, recurring calf strains, shin splints, runner's knee. So by that I mean patellofemoral pain, ITB syndrome, patellar tendinopathy, high hamstring tendinopathies, piriformis syndrome, low back pain. There really is quite a handful of common injuries that lie in this overuse kind of category. Very different to if you've stepped off a curb or tripped over a tree root and you've sprained your ankle. These are more acute and not to do specifically with training errors or movement dysfunctions or anything like that. But the list of these kind of common running injuries that I've just described there, they can all be characterized by some sort of overload that's been exacerbated by training volume. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and so what's roughly the prevalence of these? Do you have any numbers?
Yeah, so prevalence, it's an interesting one when you start to actually look at the research that's out there. And if you really get into it, you'll see figures between kind of 19-20% of runners getting injured in a 12-month period up to some papers that suggest 90% of runners get injured within a 12-month period. So it really is a huge spread. Talking about it more anecdotally, I always find it amazing when I'm doing running workshops and you've got a kind of group of 20, 30, 60 runners in front of you, and you kind of ask the question, how many of you have been injured in the last 18 months, injured in the last year? It is scary how many hands go up. As standard, I'm never surprised these days if I see 2/3 of the group in front of me who say, yeah, I've had an injury that's interrupted my running, a running injury that's interrupted my running over the last 18 months. So those figures, as much as it's a big spread, it's I would expect it to be kind of on the higher side of that. There was a meta-analysis done in 2015 which looked at incidence of running injuries per 1,000 hours, which I found was quite interesting. It was a different way of kind of talking about it, different way of quantifying it. And I'll actually make sure there's the link in the show notes so that you can go back and look at the paper. But basically they were saying that with runners of kind of a novice category, they put it novice runners and recreational runners. There was two slightly different kind of weightings, if you like, in terms of the number of injuries they seem to pick up across 1,000 hours. So for your novice runners, it seemed to be an average of 17.8 injuries per 1,000 hours of running, whereas your recreational runners, so slightly more serious yet not sub-elite, it was 7.7 injuries per 1,000 hours of running. So again, far more to it if you actually get into the paper itself. But in terms of a bit of a takeaway line, I found that quite interesting and again correlates with my experience, particularly of, unfortunately, novice runners, so beginners who struggle with injuries like, to take a classic example, shin splints, an example of a running injury that's very much thought of as, in many respects, an injury that a lot of beginners suffer with, because it is so much to do with the loading aspect and the load management aspect, and people doing too much too soon. And body weight's a big factor, just like plantar fasciitis. Again, body weight's a big factor. That there seem to be far more injuries in that novice period than as we get more experienced as runners. Not true for everybody, but certainly seems to ring a bell when you see as well how many new runners tend to get very frustrated with the process of being a new runner and unfortunately give up. It's very sad to see. And again, just trying to, it's part of what we do here at Kinetic Revolution, is try and kind of give the advice in terms of helping people avoid doing too much too soon and allowing them to build up gradually and hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that many of us, myself included, and no doubt yourself included, have made over the years. So it's one of those that unfortunately, I think especially, if we think about this from a triathlon point of view, the way in which it's very much of the three disciplines, the big load-bearing discipline, and the way in which it's such a repetitive cyclical pattern, running gait, especially if you're doing all your running on the road rather than the trail, then all of a sudden it's very easy to see how your body's going to unfortunately find its weak link quite quickly unless you're doing all the appropriate strengthening and stability and mobility exercises. And a note on that as well, while you're doing all the strength and stability and mobility exercises, you can do all of those to the absolute letter and have the most perfect maintenance routine, rehab routine, prehab routine, injury prevention routine, whatever you want to call it. But if you're making fundamental training errors, that won't save you. You need to make sure that your training plan is sensible in terms of the progressions and in terms of factoring in adaptation weeks, so weeks where you reduce the volume to allow your body to adapt before you can push again. The biggest risk factor to running injury is training error, and that's kind of something that I think a lot of people need to appreciate.
Yeah, and that's the biggest risk to improving as a triathlete as well. If you can stay consistent, then that's going to harm your progress. So the best training plan is the one that keeps you injury-free and keeps you training consistently. So with that said, what are the most common dysfunctional movement patterns that you see that cause these different overuse injuries? So just going to a couple of the most common problems that you see.
Yeah, so particularly if we think of it from a triathlon point of view, but actually this is the same conversation as we'd have for a recreational, let's say, marathon runner point of view. If we think about common movement patterns, common dysfunctional patterns, it's got to be the kind of the interplay between stride length and stride frequency. So where people find that because they're running with a very low cadence, not even a very low cadence, just a cadence that is too low for the given pace, the only way they can adapt to make sure they can still run the given pace is to increase stride length and start to overstride. So let's just clarify a few terms there. Cadence, what I mean by that is stride frequency. Call it stride frequency, call it stride rate, step rate, leg speed. It's a number. It's the number of times your legs turn over per minute. And if we think of the way in which you achieve a given running pace as being the output of an equation, then the equation is stride length times stride frequency. So how much ground are you covering per stride, and how many times are you doing that every minute? Now that is hopefully in balance, where you'll, for a given pace, let's say you're running 5 minutes per K, for a given pace, you'll be covering enough ground per stride to mean that you can maintain the pace, and you'll be turning your legs over at a cadence which matches that, which means you don't have to overstride. Now, if your cadence is too low, if your cadence is dropped, so let's say instead of running at 100, what a commonly quoted figure is 180 strides per minute. Perhaps we can talk about that later. But if we are getting you running at 180 strides per minute, and instead of 180 strides per minute, you drop the cadence to 160 strides per minute, which is actually a very common cadence that I find particularly us guys, us male athletes recreationally often tend to come in and test at an easy pace. Then if you want to keep running at 5 minutes per K, your only option, given that your cadence has dropped so much, is to increase the stride length. If you're making less strides in the minute, then those strides had better be longer to mean that you can still maintain that speed over the ground. The problem is, as you start to make those longer strides, you start putting the foot down in the ground in front of you, more so than is efficient, because the further in front of the body that foot hits the ground, the more decelerative ground reaction force your body is going to have to deal with, which essentially is a braking force. It's slowing you down stride by stride, but it's also a lot of impact that comes back at you. Okay, it comes back up through the system. If we think about the major joints from ground upwards, we're thinking about the ankle, the knee, the hips, and it's in very basic terms, it's going to increase the amount of pounding that your body has to deal with per stride. So if we think in triathlon terms about the interplay between stride length and stride frequency, and the way that I often try and talk to triathletes in terms of trying to relate it to cycling, is that cadence is cadence. Okay, cadence is just a number, it's just a frequency. So whether we're talking about the number of pedal strokes you make in a minute, or the number of times you turn your legs over when you're running in a minute, it's just a frequency. And gearing is the same as stride length in this context, or the other way around. Stride length can be spoken about the same as gear selection on the bike. So what we see so often with these overstriding runners, those who are landing their feet too far in front of them because they're running with too slow a cadence, it's the same as being a triathlete sitting on the bike and turning your legs over too slowly and selecting too heavy of a gear and making life a lot harder for yourself, rather than dialing back a few gears, making life a little bit easier, spinning your legs out. So again, when talking to triathletes, talking about learning to spin your legs out, making small, quick strides instead of the slightly more slower, heavier strides, it's all about trying to get you away from overstriding, getting you landing your feet underneath the flexing knee, closer to underneath your center of mass.
Perfect. So that's cadence or the balance between cadence and stride length. Do we have anything else in terms of the biggest problems for dysfunctional movement patterns that cause overuse injuries?
Yeah, another big one as well, and this is very, very pertinent to triathletes because of the time spent on the bike and your corporate triathletes as well. So your corporate Ironman, you're doing perhaps 50, 60 hours a week in the office, and then you're doing everything that goes into Ironman training. In particular, what I'm talking about there is the amount of time spent on the bike in comparison to training for sprint and Olympic. You are spending a lot of time in a very flexed hip position. Okay, so even if your bike fit is set up brilliantly, even if you're trying to keep the hip angle as open as you can, it's still going to be very much a flexion dominant and a quad dominant movement on the bike. You're going to be getting into a position where potentially hip extension, which is the movement from the hip of driving the leg backwards. If you can imagine when your foot's on the ground when you're running, the point where the foot's underneath the hip to the point where you leave the ground, the way in which the leg drives back, the quality of that might be somewhat undermined by all this time we spend sitting down. So all the potential tightness through those hip flexors that comes from that, and the weakness through those glutes and hamstrings that comes secondarily to that. So what we end up with is a position where, because of potentially the tightness through those hip flexors, we end up not being able to use our glutes as effectively as the prime mover into extension, the prime source of that power into the push-off phase, the kind of the drive phase from the hip. So from the point where, during this propulsive phase, the point where you go from mid-stance where the foot's under the hip to the point where, as I said earlier, you drive that foot off the ground, ideally, that power should come from the hip. And if we can't get the power coming from those glutes because of the tightness in those hip flexors, what we end up doing is finding a compensatory way that the body can still produce that propulsion. And the compensation in that instance usually comes from having to work harder through those plantar flexor muscles around the ankle and the lower leg, those calf muscles. So we see lots of triathletes who unfortunately struggle with recurring calf strains, Achilles problems, even plantar fasciitis, where as much as you need to do all the appropriate rehab for the injured tissue, you also need to look further up the chain and understand that if the hips aren't moving properly, if we haven't got good quality hip extension, good glute activation, and perhaps that's because of tightness at the front of the hip, whether obviously those glutes are at the back of the hip, those butt muscles. If we're limited in terms of the capacity to use those butt muscles because of tightness around the front of the hip, that's not only going to cause problems locally to the hip, that can also have those knock-on effects in terms of overusing those muscles in the lower leg, which are really there for force transfer. And if we think about the smaller muscles like tibialis posterior, he's there for providing control and stability around the ankle. But that whole complex can start to be overloaded when we don't work effectively from the hip.
Yeah, perfect. So that's a good overview of that as well, and a great example for the listeners about why you should make sure that you find the root cause of whatever problems you may have, and it's not necessarily where you actually have the pain that the root cause of the problem is. So what practical advice should we give to the triathletes that are listening to this? What can you do in your prehab routine first and foremost, or is that even where we start, or is there something else that we should start with?
Yeah, I mean, we can get into prehab routines for sure, and maintenance routines. I think a great place to start is actually trying to get a decent screening done, a decent assessment done. It's important that you have someone who can, especially if you have a history of injuries, and which unfortunately so many of us endurance athletes we do. If you know that you are historically susceptible to certain things, before you're about to embark on a new training block or something along those lines, then go and find a physical therapist who can take you through a screening and perhaps give you areas to go and work on, which are specific to the imbalances and the dysfunctions potentially that they find. It could be a physical therapist, it could be some sort of coach, personal trainer, someone who has a background in ideally exercise therapy, so that they can think from, again, a rehab and a prehab perspective, having assessed how you move individually. Now, that said, I know that's not going to be accessible for everybody. Some people have got fantastic, sports medicine practices on their doorstep. Other people are in the middle of nowhere and don't have anybody with that sort of skill set. What you can do especially bearing in mind what I was saying earlier in terms of looking at something as basic as stride length. Are you overstriding? Are you landing too far in front of yourself? You can these days use your smartphone. You can literally set up a smartphone with an app like Huddle, so that's HUDL, or Coach's Eye, and to be honest, there are a number of different apps you can use that provide a very similar functionality, where you can capture the footage and review the footage in slow motion on your phone. It used to be, and I was actually talking to a client about this today, we were laughing as we were outside capturing some footage. It used to be that I'd need to bring a high-speed camera outside, and we'd actually set that up with the tripod and capture the footage there to get the frame rate as much as anything else. Where now with iPhone 7, filming through the Huddle app in 240 frames per second, that's all in terms of tech, that's literally all you need to get decent quality video analysis footage at your fingertips, and then you can start to dissect that and get a better idea of what's going on. So as an absolute baseline, we can start thinking about running in the same way that traditionally triathletes think about swimming. Plenty of your listeners will have had someone in the pool, alongside them while they're in the pool, taking footage from multiple different angles, from above the water, below the water, etc., to understand your swim stroke a bit better. We can start thinking about running in the same way, and use technology that we kind of carry around in our pockets to be able to actually achieve that. So that's certainly a good start point. Now, from a point of view of what can we do to help ourselves when it comes to putting together a decent prehab routine, maintenance routine, kind of injury prevention routine, from a triathlon point of view, there are a few key areas that are very similar to an out-and-out runner, so a marathon runner. There are also some key areas which are perhaps a little bit different. So as a kind of a constant, we're going to be wanting to look at things like hip mobility. We're going to be wanting to look at ways in which, as I began to describe earlier when we were talking about the hip versus the ankle and the calf injuries, the ways in which we can offset the daily patterns that the desk and the bike and the sofa and the car and pretty much everything we as 21st century humans tend to do sets us up as what we can offset time spent sat down by improving the quality of movement around those hips and learning to activate again those important gluteal muscles in particular, those muscles that tend to switch off when we do spend too long sat down. That's going to be a great start point. We can also then look further down the chain and think about proprioception and ankle stability. So thinking about running as being running as obviously being the big load-bearing aspect of triathlon. There is a really interesting kind of anecdote, I don't know if that's the right word, but observation that we made. We have a training group up here in Norwich that a couple of years ago we did some regular Wednesday morning strength and conditioning classes, where during the summer we'd actually go out and do the classes out in the park, which was fantastic. 7:00 in the morning, nice, beautiful time to be up in the middle of the summer. Not too many people around, and it was very enjoyable. But as soon as summer ended and winter began to knock on the door, we found this before we had the studio I'm currently in. We actually went and found an indoor studio to go and do the same work. But in the studio, we took our shoes off, whereas we were shod outside. We were in our trainers outside. In the studio, doing the same exercises barefoot seemed to give far more comprehensive workout to the ankles and the intrinsic muscles within the foot, which is a debatable area. Some people do, some people don't believe that's something that simply by taking your shoes off you strengthen. I certainly saw firsthand that week after week after week, people's balance improved, people's stability improved just by spending a bit of time doing those exercises barefoot. Things like single leg squats, things like arabesques, those kind of exercises that are in the that you'll find on the Kinetic Revolution website. Ankle stability, core stability, and again, what do we mean by core stability? It's not about being able to hold a 7-minute plank. It's not about those kinds of things. It's more about actually controlling the position of particularly your lower back, pelvis, and hips whilst the extremities are moving. So if you're looking to again, from a swim point of view, as powerfully as a run point of view, and actually from a bike point of view as well, the power that we're looking to create, whether it's swimming wise with the upper body, or whether it's we're looking to get a good solid push off as we're running, or we're looking to get good force transfer between lower body and upper body and create this nice stable base as we're cycling. The stable base is the most important part of that whole conversation, and creating good quality control of movement through that kind of lumbopelvic hip region is something that, again, more people could spend working a little bit more time on, and it would benefit all three disciplines. Shoulder health for triathletes is a really important one as well. So, obviously time spent in the pool is going to suddenly become problematic if you've given yourself an impingement problem through your shoulder or a rotator cuff problem in your shoulder because of poor thoracic mobility. So mobility of the mid and upper spine. So there's plenty of work, again, that fits alongside the whole conversation I was having about spending too much time sat down. If you find yourself kind of curled forwards over your desk as you're sitting down, perhaps as you're even listening to this, we need to work on getting you into a position where you're able to display good quality thoracic mobility, good quality thoracic extension and rotation, so that you can actually move in terms of the shoulder girdle. So not just the way in which the arm interfaces with the torso, but also the actual scapula, the shoulder blade. He needs to be able to move around the rib cage, and if he can't move well around the rib cage because the upper and mid back is limited in its range of motion, then all of a sudden it's going to put more demand on the shoulder. So foam rolling the mid back for shoulder health is super important. Rotator cuff exercises, super important. So great resistance band work you can do there. And I mentioned there, foam rolling in general from a recovery point of view, calves, anything around the hips, quads, hamstrings, super helpful as a recovery tool for us recreational athletes.
So let's say that you are completely healthy at the moment, but you're not doing any maintenance routines. What should you do, like just as a very general guideline? How many of these maintenance sessions should you do, and what should they consist of in terms of core strength and foam rolling and so on? If you can give us any sort of indication in that direction. Yeah,
absolutely. And people will give you different advice on this, but I am a big fan of little and often. There will be people who are in a good routine of going to the gym perhaps twice a week for an hour, 90 minutes, and that's a routine that's working for them. But I like to be practical and find that from a point of view of actually fitting the routine in around training for, and let's face it, if you're training for a marathon, that's tough enough, let alone training for 3 disciplines. If you're training to swim, bike and run, and all the logistics that go around that, it's far more likely that I will be able to get a triathlete to say yes to doing 3 or 4 15-minute workouts in the week, instead of saying I need you to change your whole routine and actually find time to go to the gym and do that perhaps twice a week. So with the whole kind of idea of short and sweet workouts, short and achievable workouts, I would definitely prioritize exercises like let's not even talk yet about specific exercises. Let's talk about a balance between different types of exercises you can get within a routine. So if you're putting together a routine that's going to take me 15 minutes and I can do I can have 3 of these routines across a week, I want to get some mobility work for sure, and some of that might be working on a foam roller, some of that might be more stretch based. I want to get some activation work, and I want to get some strengthening work in there as well. So from a mobility point of view, there's all sorts we can do from, as I mentioned earlier, some regular calf foam rolling, some foam rolling and tennis ball work around the hips to start to, let's say if you're struggling, historically you've struggled with piriformis syndrome, we can get you spending a couple of minutes each time you come to do these sessions, just starting to dig into that whole kind of deeper gluteal region with a tennis ball to start to kind of work on any trigger points that might be there. We can then move on and start to do a little bit of glute activation work. I think we'll probably later on start moving on to talking about things like resistance bands. So I'm a big fan of resistance bands as a really practical and really versatile tool. So some resistance band activation work for your glutes. Perhaps it's a bridge variation would be fantastic. So lying on your back in a classic kind of bridge position, but with the band around your knees, pulling the band apart and holding for 5 to 10 seconds, 10 times 5 or 10 seconds of that would be a great place to start with that. Again, the video to that I can make sure that you've got, Michael, and you can link up in the show notes so that people can visualize what I'm talking about, because it's very hard to explain. And then from there you can move on and you can start doing perhaps a little bit more in terms of strengthening work. So if we're looking at exercises like either a split squat, and again, in terms of big bang for the buck exercises, from a running perspective, a split squat, or call it a static lunge if you like, is a fantastic exercise, because not only does it start to isolate out left leg versus right leg in comparison to the symmetry of a normal kind of air squat, where you're just standing bilaterally, just dealing with body weight with your feet in parallel, where you're balancing your body weight right versus left. This actually starts to, if you're left foot forward, you're going to be putting more of an emphasis on that left hand side. And as you work down into that split squat, you're actually working on the separation between the extending hip and the flexing hip. So you're really starting to work in opposite directions between those two hips and start to build a bit of strength into the fact that you're also building stride length, starting to open up those hips a little bit more. Working, again, unilaterally and doing that, you'll be working particularly quads and glutes on that standing leg. And from a strengthening point of view, and on the rear leg, you're going to be getting a bit more in terms of an anterior hip and anterior thigh kind of mobilization. So again, quads and hip flexors going to be getting a good bit of mobilization there. And that can be built into something like a Bulgarian split squat. Or it could be built into, even onwards from there, you can get more into your kind of splits, your single leg squat variations. Again, once you go single leg squat variations, there are all sorts of different variations there. So I began to talk about Romanian deadlifts. Again, single leg Romanian deadlifts, very good hamstring orientated exercise. Another good way of beginning to combine two different types of exercise. So we've got an exercise which is very kind of hamstring and glute orientated, yet we're doing it in a single leg position. So it's like double win. We're practicing single leg stability and we're working on strengthening the posterior chain, so the muscles at the back side of the body, which from our running point of view is super important, because from a triathlon perspective, as we're spending time on the bike, we know that that's going to be very quads heavy. What we don't want to do is suddenly find that as we're running, we're relying on our quads because we're quite weak for our glutes and hamstrings, and the problem there being that our quads are already tired off the bike. We need good, strong glutes and hamstrings to hold us upright as we're running and to allow us to get this good, good posterior chain to hold us upright as we're running. So the posterior chain really goes from top to bottom up the back side of the body there. But from a glutes and hamstrings point of view, which is a big component part of the posterior chain, that's going to really help us in terms of providing that good, strong push off as we're running. And from a gluteal point of view, obviously the stability as well. And then from a core perspective, I said earlier that it's not just about being able to do a 7-minute plank. That's not me saying planks are bad. I just would much rather have you do some sort of dynamic planking exercise rather than just holding a static position for time. So I'm far more interested in getting you doing something like a side plank with a leg raise, or getting you doing a plank, a reverse plank with alternate leg raise, or a side plank with a kind of a running man action with that top leg. Those sorts of things where you have to actually control movement whilst you're in that very challenging plank-like position. That's certainly a real challenge. And from a triathlon point of view, it's great to actually begin to put a bit of load through the upper body, because obviously, depending on, regardless of kind of riding style, it's far more of an upper body challenge than just running alone, certainly.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. We have a complete routine here, so nobody has any excuse not to start implementing this. And we'll make sure to have everything in the show notes, and maybe you can help me out with some links, because you probably have a lot of those already on your YouTube channel or similar, so that people can have a good look at how to do those different exercises.
Yeah, well, why don't we do one step further than that? Why don't we put together just a couple of example routines that people can just download from the show notes, and they can have that as a resource?
Yeah, absolutely, perfect. Let's do that. We're quickly coming up on time. I could talk for a long time still, but I know that some listeners have want to keep it a bit shorter in that 45-minute range, these episodes. So that's what I'm trying to do, even though don't always succeed. But so I'll let you take the mic from here. And I know you wanted to talk about resistance band, and if there's anything else that you want to talk about, feel free. But let's try to wrap it up pretty soon here. And I also have my rapid fire questions for you. So let's keep it to the most important things that you still want to talk about, James.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned resistance bands. We'll quickly cover that off. A lot of people kind of ask me in terms of what the kind of most important tool, if you like, that I get people to make sure they always have in their home gym or in their suitcase or what have you. I just find resistance bands are super versatile. It's not that us runners and triathletes need to start lifting heavy weights. That said, there is a definite time of year, a definite time of the season where there is huge value to spending 6 weeks, 8 weeks, doing some real heavy resistance work to build a foundational kind of level of strength. That's something that needs to be supervised, and it's not something that you need to just get off YouTube. I'd always rather you guys work with a trainer or something like that to be able to make sure technique is spot on. When I start saying to you, lift, we need you doing squats, five sets of 5 as heavy as you can, those sorts of things, you need to make sure technique is spot on. But when beginning to add a little bit of resistance to some of the exercises we do, resistance bands are just so versatile. There's so much you can do with them. It's well worth investing if you haven't already. Definitely. The big thing I wanted to cover off, though, was about rehab from injuries, general guidelines to those, and that as much as for whatever your individual injury might be, whether it's plantar fasciitis, shin splints, high hamstring tendinopathy, piriformis syndrome, whatever it is, you need to see a physio. Okay, Dr. Google can be a very terrifying person in the first place. He's going to tell you you're going to die probably quite quickly. But he is also not going to be able to be very specific about your real needs from a rehab point of view. You need someone who can look at you, assess you, and be able to tell you what you specifically need to do from a rehab perspective. Now, once you are onto a good rehab plan, the most critical place to get it right first time is in your return to running phase. Okay, as you get back into running, there are 3, just like with everything else we do from a training plan point of view, there are 3 main components, 3 main variables that we're dealing with, and that's volume, frequency, and intensity. And that is the order that we'd bring back your running in a return to run program. So, and again, there's a return to run program that I can make sure is linked in the show notes here, but I get people running to begin with just to gradually increase volume, and it starts very, very low. Starts at 1 minute run, 1 minute walk, times 10, go home. That's first session, done. And you're doing that in the first week 3 times on non-consecutive days. And that's really important. You don't want to run back-to-back days at this point. You need to give your body time to adapt as the tissue that has been injured is beginning to again get stronger.
Sorry to interject here, but how long of an injury are we talking about here when you need to get back gradually like this? If it's just a couple of days off with a niggle, I guess that this doesn't really hold true. But
no, I completely agree, and this is a really important caveat to put on. I'm talking about something where you've been away from running for, let's say, 6 weeks. Or you've tried to get back into running once and failed already, and you've had to have a little bit of a longer period off, or had to repeat the layoff from running, and you need this time to really take it as a gentle return back. Now, you can certainly speed up the process if it's been, I need to take a week off, 2 weeks off. It's just not going to be a 12-week return to running program by any means. But the principle would still be the same. It would be, to begin with, if you've taken if you've taken a week off, for example, the first run back is still going to be low volume, easy pace, very gentle on the body. Tick that box. Next run, we build the volume. Again, tick that box. Then, if you're used to running back-to-back days in the week, so you're used to perhaps running, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, I would make sure that to begin with, we don't do back-to-back days. Okay, we make sure there's time to adapt, time to recover in between. But then the next thing we do factor in, whilst we're keeping the running easy, is we begin to factor in back-to-back days to see if you can handle that load back-to-back. Then once you tick that box and you get to a point where you can actually say that, yes, volume is increasing and I have no problem. Frequency, I've gone from doing 2 runs per week to 3 runs per week, or 3 runs per week to 4 runs per week. Once you've got a couple of those weeks ticked, that's where I'd go to intensity. And that's where I'd say, once I've got those first 2 right, that's where I bring in tempo work. That's where I bring in interval work. That's where I bring in hill work. Because the intensity work is going to be just more stress on the body, basically, and stress on the injured tissue in the first place. Now, this might be a process, as you rightly say, that we get done over 3 weeks. So you've taken 2 weeks off and you've been careful. Let's just say you've been careful for 3 weeks as you build back in. And that's the order you build things back in. And then you're full training. Everything's good. We're good to go. If you've been off for 6, 8, 12 weeks with a real nasty stress fracture or something like that, then that's where we say, yeah, you know what, let's get this right first time. Let's say perhaps I don't know, you might be able to get back to running in 6 weeks, but let's actually do this gradually over 12 weeks and make sure that we get this right the first time. We don't give you another stress fracture by trying to rush you back too quickly. And we take the longer term approach. Again, different people will have different speeds on this. Different people will get through this at different paces. But in terms of being conservative and sensible, which isn't always fun, that's the conversation I would have with people.
Yeah, it's not always fun, but for most people, in most cases, there might be exceptions. Let's say that you have qualified for the Ironman World Championships or something. Then you might take the speedy approach. It might be worth the risk, but in most cases, you won't have that need. You feel that you have it, and I feel that I have it, but you really don't. So it's that's where it's great to have a coach or an expert, an outside expert like a physio that can tell you what to do.
Look, my background, before I even thought I would be the running guy, my background is in rugby, and I played rugby at a professional level for a number of years. I understand the pressures of performing when your body probably shouldn't. There's a big game. It's exactly the same in your head as there's a big race, and you just have to have a very open and frank conversation about risks, rewards. What's the worst case scenario? Is that worth? What are the chances of the worst case scenario? And is that worth the potential of the best case scenario? And every case is different, definitely. But no, I understand for sure.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to the rapid fire questions and start with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to running, endurance sports, triathlon, or anything along these lines?
I spent a little bit of time thinking about this, and there's obviously all sorts out there. And I just thought, what's the resource that I have used probably the most in the last 6 weeks? And I've been writing a lot of marathon plans for people. And I'm actually going to go to an online resource, an online calculator, so a VDOT calculator, Jack Daniels VDOT calculator, which I have been pointing a lot of people towards in terms of getting training paces under control. Because a lot of people fall into that mistaken place where they are running their easy runs too hard and making themselves too tired for their quality sessions, and actually just pointing out to them that, look, here's some objective data that you can actually look at based on recent race performances to look at what your easy pace running should be. And training paces, interval, for various different distance intervals and things like that, what your tempo pace should be. So pointing people towards that certainly tends to open a few eyes quite wide, where they suddenly realise that, actually I probably need to work on my pacing a little bit better. So again, I'll send you the link to the particular calculator that I push people towards.
Yeah, I love that. I've used that as well. What's your favorite piece of gear or equipment?
I think I think it's those resistance bands. So. I need to start giving people some sort of affiliate link for commission for resistance bands. I think I'd make a killing.
Yeah. Do you like the stability ball?
Yes, definitely. It's another good piece of kit. Basically, anything which is going to challenge you from a core point of view, anything that's going to challenge you from a stability point of view, is going to help you train your core. Definitely.
And finally, what's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
It's getting stuff done in the morning before I actually open my emails. And that could be whether it's doing my 30-day challenge routine, or whether it is doing whether it's getting out for a run, or whether it's whatever it is around the house, just not getting sucked into the vacuum that is your personal and business emails. So I know that there's far more chance of me getting out for a morning run if I run before I open my laptop than there is if I do it the other way around.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so finally, James, where can people find out more about you? I think there are a lot of ways, so we'll have all those links linked up, of course, but give us the best ways, the ones that you would recommend.
Best place to find me is actually to get involved in our Transform Your Running Facebook group. That way, that's kind of the place that at the moment kind of holds most of my attention online, and the best way to kind of interact back and forth through that. You can also private message me on Facebook. Twitter, is also fantastic. Make sure that I check in on there on a regular basis. And just if you need to email me through the website is the best way to do it, definitely.
Perfect, and everything will, as I said, be linked up. All right, thank you again, James, so much for your time. You've been very generous with it, and we could have gone on for a long time, but I guess that we might have you on for some other time, and listeners can send in questions until then about what they want you to talk about next time, and maybe go into some specifics if that sounds like a good idea to you.
Sounds very good, definitely. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you. Bye. All right, I hope that you enjoyed that interview. Be sure to leave feedback on email. My email address is michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. Or you can hit me up on Twitter @SciTriat, and you'll also find James on Twitter. You'll have all his contact information in the show notes, which will be on thattriathlonshow.com. And as mentioned in the episode, we will have those complete maintenance routines available for you on thattriathlonshow.com on the show notes page, so make sure to check that out. On the next episode, we have another exciting interview coming up. This one will be with Rob Sleemaker of Vasa Trainer, which is kind of like, how should I describe it? A treadmill for swimming, maybe. Maybe that's the right way to describe it. I think Rob will do a much better job than me of describing it. But that is, we will not just talk about that, the actual equipment, but also some of the general problems with swim training. And for some people, it's not that easy to get into a pool on a regular basis, and so on, and what you can do, and how important things like strength training and so on are for swimming as well. And then the episode after that will be with Patrick Kahn, who is a fantastic sport psychologist, and we will talk about having confidence and the importance of confidence in triathlon and how it really is a big part of your performance. So, to make sure that you don't miss those episodes coming up, make sure that you hit subscribe. Folks, if you aren't subscribed already, you will have a lot of other exciting interviews as well coming up in the pipeline that I won't talk about just yet, but you don't want to miss it. So, hit subscribe in your podcast player app if you haven't already. Have a fantastic beginning of August. I look forward to talking to you again on Thursday. And until then, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.